Again, my name is Martin Melkonian. I'm with the Center for Civic Engagement's Institute for Peace Studies. And today is one of a two-part series dealing with the Ukraine conflict. We're very pleased to have outstanding guests today. Mario will introduce them, Mario Murillo. And 2 weeks from today, we're going to have Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst who will also be talking about Ukraine. So I hope you'll be able to attend that. That will be at 1 p.m. 2 weeks from today, October 12th. Okay? And there'll be flyers in the back for those of you that may want them. In any event, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Mario Murillo, who will tell us a little something about our guests.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you everybody for coming today on such a beautiful day where I know most of us would love to be out there playing Frisbee. But it's great to have you here, especially for this very important panel, and I'm glad to have our two guests here, Aaron and Professor Xaykaothao. Just to give you a sense, the Center for Civic Engagement, how many of you know about the CCE, Center for Civic Engagement? I would encourage you, if you don't, to look it up on the website, the Hofstra website, CCE. They do great work here on campus, these kinds of events, but also in the community. And I'm a proud former director of CCE, but also a proud member of the advisory board. And I'm really happy to be a part of and having been one of the faculty who developed the Institute for Peace Studies here on campus. A lot of people don't know about it. That's part of the challenge, because to make peace visible is sometimes hard. War is really easy to promote. Peace is a lot harder. And so if you haven't heard about the Institute for Peace Studies, I hopefully you'll shine some lights and turn on some lights in your mind, and you can get involved in some of the work. And also great thanks to the Hofstra Cultural Center, who is involved with promoting so many great events on campus. And then a community organization, which Marty didn't mention, the Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives, which is also a community group that does so much great work, obviously in defense of peace and trying to end conflicts locally, nationally, and of course around the world. So my name is Mario Murillo. For those of you who don't know me, I am a professor in the radio, television, film department. I teach radio journalism, media studies, and Latin American studies. Currently the vice dean of the Herbert School of Communication. So I was really happy that Marty reached out to me about this session that he had in mind to do a focus on Ukraine, and in particular to focus on media coverage, the attention that this war, this horrific war that's been going on now almost 20 months, it's almost routine now. We see it and it's like we're not even paying attention in many ways to what's happening there. And I thought it's a great opportunity to focus on how media, how journalists, how reporters, how TV networks, etc., are framing and going through this horrific human situation that's developing in Europe, but that's impacting the entire world. We have two great panelists. We have Aaron Maté, who's, I've known him for a long time. He's an independent journalist with the Grayzone, and he hosts the podcast Pushback. He's a contributor to Real Clear Investigations. He's written a number of articles and done a lot of work around various issues of global significance. He's a temporary co-host for the show Useful Idiots. And in 2019, he won the Izzy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Independent Media for Russiagate coverage in the Nation magazine. So as you can see, he's reported and produced and contributed to many different news sites, including the Real News Network, Vice, The Nation, and Democracy Now!, a program that's a national distributed program on television, on radio, on the web. And today was interesting because they had an exclusive interview with the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, who was participating this week in the UN General Assembly. And he had an interesting take on what is happening in Ukraine, talking about the need for an international summit, peace summit, to try to resolve this conflict diplomatically through peaceful means, because clearly a military solution doesn't seem to be in sight for anybody, and that's not good for anybody. So it was good to hear that this morning on this national program, which is not getting much space. That conversation is not really being heard much, certainly in the broader news media in the U.S. Our other guest is a good friend, Doualy Xaykaothao. She's a Professional in Residence is her title for News and Public Affairs at the WRHU Community Radio Licensee of Hofstra University. How many of you have heard of WRHU Radio, Hofstra University? All right. Let's give, I think they deserve a hand. Right, Chris? All right. 88.7 FM, online at wrhu.org. She works with the students on the morning show on Newsline. She's also an adjunct associate professor of RTVF, teaching radio in our radio, television, film department at the university, at the Herbert School. And she's also the coordinator of the academic program in audio radio production and studies, which is probably the smallest program in the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication, but I would say the most important, because that's what I do, radio. She's also, aside from her work here, she's a longtime producer and reporter. Let me just read here. She first joined NPR in 1999, a long time ago, and has worked as a producer, editor, director, and reporter for NPR's award-winning news magazines, Morning Edition, All Things Considered, Weekend Edition, of course. She's also worked at Minnesota Public Radio and at NPR member stations, KERA, KPCC, and KCRW. Professor X, as she's belovedly called and referred to here on campus, is a multi-platform journalist whose work has won Edward R. Murrow and Peabody Awards, and she earned her Bachelor of Arts from SUNY Empire and has a Master's of Arts in Business and Economics Journalism from Columbia University. And she, most importantly and relevant to this conversation, over the last 20 months during the war in Ukraine, she has had the honor, the privilege of having been there, but I think it's probably horrific. But she spent not once, but twice, has gone to Ukraine during this conflict, during this war, and spent extended periods of time there talking to normal people, talking to people who've been affected by the ongoing assault, who've been forcibly displaced, who've lost family members, who are struggling with the daily horrors and shadows of war that most of us, thank goodness, probably have not experienced. So she's going to talk a little bit about that today. So to get things started, what I wanted to do, and bear with me, I'm going to read a little headlines. This morning I collected headlines from like 3 or 4 different news sources, New York Times, Paper of Record, NPR, the radio of record, I suppose, Reuters, and a couple of other outlets. So I'm just literally pulling a bunch of news headlines, clippings from all those without specifying which one is from where, but generally it pretty much flows naturally. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is in Washington today making a renewed pitch for U.S. aid to support his country's ongoing fight against Russia. A new round of funding is in limbo ahead of a looming government shutdown in the U.S. How many of you knew that Zelensky was in D.C. today? That's good. Okay. Zelensky's itinerary includes a morning on Capitol Hill for bipartisan meetings with lawmakers. Later, he will meet with U.S. military officials at the Pentagon. Then will meet with President Biden in the Oval Office, the 6th meeting between the two leaders. No country has provided more funding to Ukraine than the United States. Total aid to Ukraine has topped $112 billion, with another round of funding currently tied up in Congress, like just about everything else is tied up right now in Congress. Appetite to send new funds to Ukraine among congressional lawmakers and the public alike has begun to falter as the war enters its 20th month. A so-called counter-offensive that began in June is still well short of Ukraine's stated goals, with just a month or two left before winter sets in. Biden has asked Congress to approve $24 billion in new aid to Ukraine. The funding has no obvious path to passage in the near term due as Congress nears an end-of-the-month deadline to approve new spending or face a government shutdown, which I think we've all heard. Far-right House Republicans have shown little appetite in approving a bill, and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy's leadership seat could be in danger. Russia pounded energy, and then this is now on the war front, because this is all politics internally in Washington, but very typical of the coverage that we see on a daily basis around Ukraine. And then we get some coverage of the war. Russia pounded energy facilities across Ukraine on Thursday in its biggest missile attack for weeks, firing what Ukrainian officials saw as the first salvo in a new air campaign against the national power grid. Power cuts were reported in 5 Ukrainian regions in the west, center, and east, reviving memories of multiple airstrikes on critical infrastructure last winter that caused sweeping outages for millions during the bitter cold. And then I have a few more other headlines that are similarly tragic in terms of the actual fighting and war and military aspects of it. So those are just some of the headlines. What we don't hear really are any headlines or news about peace initiatives, diplomacy, attempts at trying to resolve this in a different fashion than militarily. And in those collections of, and again, I didn't do a comprehensive look, I was rushing through it this morning, other global perspectives about what's happening in Ukraine and how we could put an end to this horrific war. So that was what we're going to kind of try to focus here and make some sense of it. And so again, with Aaron and with Doualy here, their perspectives. So Aaron, let me just start with you. In your latest piece that you wrote for Substack, the title is NATO Prepares for Long War in Ukraine. As time runs out on Ukraine's counteroffensive, NATO leaders promise an extended conflict with Russia while admitting how easily it could have been avoided. So maybe you can kind of just opening up your reflections about the state where we are now and how perhaps we could have avoided this situation, you know, in the world, but obviously impacting Ukraine.
Thank you, Mario, for having me. Thank you, Marty and Hofstra. It's great to be here. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity. Well, in terms of how this war could have been avoided, on the surface, Ukraine was invaded by Russia. Ukraine should not be invaded by anyone. And so it's natural to think that Ukraine should be given all the support it needs to resist the Russian invasion, in principle. The problem I have with that is that the question that is not asked is, could this war have been avoided? And since it began, have we done everything we could to bring it to a speedy end rather than prolong it? And if you read between the lines, not in the headlines, but if you read in the bottom of news articles, it's pretty now openly admitted that the US goal is not to help defend Ukraine. It's to use Ukraine to bleed Russia. The Pentagon chief, Lloyd Austin, said that the goal is to leave Russia weakened. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, said that the goal is to hand Putin a strategic failure in Ukraine and hurt elements of Russia's national power. The New York Times, in the first weeks of the war, reporting on the statements of White House officials anonymously, said that the U.S. aim is to lock Russia in a quagmire. Now, note how none of this has anything to do with actually defending Ukraine and helping bring the war to an end. It's instead predicated on using Ukraine to bleed Russia. And that, to me, has been the strategy from the start. And in fact, even from before the war began. Because before the war, I do think there were reasonable opportunities that could have addressed everyone's concerns to avoid this. And it's a very, very long history. And the problem with news coverage is it doesn't give this proper context. So let me just briefly say what I think are the major causes of the war and how it could have been avoided. In Ukraine particularly, it's important to remember that the war did not begin when Russia invaded in February 2022. That was a major escalation of the war. But you don't have to excuse Russia's war to recognize that that's not what started the war. And to illustrate, a few years before Russia invaded, in January 2020, Adam Schiff, who's a leading Democratic member of Congress, said this. He said, "The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here." He said this in January 2020. So he accurately recognized that the fight in Ukraine did not begin when Russia invaded. The fight was going on before then. Now, looking at his statement, I think we can dismiss the notion that we have to aid Ukraine to avoid fighting Russia here. I don't think anybody really thinks that if we're not funding a war in Ukraine, that Russia's going to invade the shores of New York or California. So why are we fighting Russia over there? Well, it gets back to a coup in 2014, which, you know, there's a long history to go into, but the point is the U.S. played a role in that coup that overthrew a government that was that was described as being pro-Russian, but really was actually trying to navigate between the West and Russia and have good relations with both. That wasn't acceptable to the U.S., so the U.S. got involved in regime change there. And there's a famous phone call of Victoria Nuland, who is now a senior official under Biden, helping to pick who the next leadership of Ukraine would be after the coup. And subsequently, it was acknowledged that people involved in the coup were even funded by so-called U.S. democracy programs. And since that, there was a war that broke out between the people who supported the coup, people who were against the coup. And there was an accord to end that war called the Minsk Accords, reached in 2015. And Germany and France brokered that truce. The US sat on the sideline. But the problem is Ukraine has a very powerful far-right contingent who did not want to have any kind of settlement that acknowledged the rights of Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine, the people who opposed the coup. And anytime the Ukrainian government tried to make steps towards implementing the Minsk Accords, they protested, including Zelensky. Zelensky ran as a peace candidate. He got over 70% of the vote. But whenever he made steps towards making peace, he was bitterly opposed by far-right nationalists who even threatened his life. There's one famous far-right leader named Dmitry Yarosh who said, Zelensky says he's willing to risk his presidency to make peace. No, he will lose his life and hang from a tree. So rather than supporting Zelensky's peace mandate, the US, I think, effectively sided with Ukraine's far right and has accordingly sabotaged peace opportunities before the war and after it began. And I'll close just by saying the biggest opportunity came in late March, early April 2022. There was the outlines of a peace deal negotiated between Ukraine and Russia. This was reported in the Ukrainian press. It was reported by the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. It was reported by the Turkish foreign minister. And it was a claim by Vladimir Putin himself that there was it wasn't totally finalized, but there was the outline of a peace deal in April 2022, brokered by Turkey between Ukraine and Russia. And the premise was basically Russia would withdraw to its pre-invasion lines. The issue of Crimea would be left unresolved, but Ukraine fundamentally would declare neutrality, would pledge not to join NATO. But according to multiple sources, Boris Johnson, who was then the Prime Minister of the UK, came over and told Zelensky, now's not the time to make peace with Russia. Now's the time to keep fighting because Putin is weak and we think we can use this as an opportunity to weaken him further. And Zelensky followed along for whatever reason. I think he followed along because it's very hard for him to do anything in the face of threats from far-right nationalists in Ukraine without the support of the US. So there was a peace deal or a potential peace deal that was sabotaged, and we know what's happened since. All this unnecessary suffering. And US officials and US lawmakers openly brag that they don't care about Ukrainians. And the most salient example is Lindsey Graham, who said in July 2022, he said, as long as we give Ukraine the military and economic support, they will fight to the last person. I don't see how it's in the interests of anyone, especially Ukrainians, to fuel a war in which they fight to the last Ukrainian. That to me is not supporting Ukraine at all.
I'm going to ask you both this question. You sort of framed some of it, Aaron, in your response about kind of the context, the historical context of what led to us, what got to us to this point. But looking at the problematic media coverage, what would you say is the, aside from the long trajectory of anti-Russian discourse in the U.S. media, which stems from the Cold War and subsequent to that, what would you say is the most problematic aspect of the U.S. media coverage of this period, time frame? And then I want, perhaps Doualy, you can also respond to that, particularly since the war, the Russian invasion began in February of 2022.
Well, broadly, we see this in every war. To justify the policy of going to war, of killing people, of sending people off to die, you have to portray your enemy as irredeemable, sort of a Hitler-like figure who can't be negotiated with. So Saddam Hussein, he had weapons of mass destruction. He was working with Al-Qaeda. You can't possibly work with someone like that. Then we found out the truth that was all a lie. I mean, it was obvious beforehand, but most people weren't told that until later on. Same with Gaddafi in Libya. To justify intervening in Libya, the Obama administration said, we're not going in for regime change. We're going in just to stop this potential genocide in this one area. And Gaddafi's handing out Viagra to his forces to commit mass rape. That was a lie. So in every situation, you always have the propaganda claim that is used to manufacture consent for war so that people cannot imagine even just having negotiations with this evil enemy who's irredeemable. And the same thing here. We're not told, for example, no establishment U.S. media outlet, for example, has reported the claim that there was a peace agreement reached in April 2022. Now, maybe there's something, I don't know. Maybe Putin was bluffing. Maybe the deal was not going to give Ukraine the basics that it needed. But at least the fact that the claim is made by multiple sources, by people close to Zelensky, by the Turkish foreign minister, by the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, by Putin himself, that they reached the outline of a peace deal. You look at the New York Times, the Washington Post, they've never even acknowledged that fact, that claim is made. Now, why would they not tell us that there was a peace deal, that there's claims that a peace deal was reached in April 2022, because once you acknowledge that, then you have to reckon with the fact that there were alternatives to fueling this catastrophic proxy war. And our media, because I think ultimately, I mean, not everybody, but the people who really make the decisions in the establishment outlets ultimately are there to serve power, not to do their jobs. Facts like that get erased.
Doualy, do you want to respond, talk about how you see it in terms of the media coverage, and especially having gone there and seen the results, does that discussion become almost academic?
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for coming and listening to this. It is not an easy subject to swallow or to connect with and to comprehend. Before I make any comments, let me just sort of put a little context to how I come to this story. And your next guest, who is a former CIA employee, will speak on some of this. But I am the granddaughter of an indigenous hill tribe in Laos. We were asked by the CIA a very long time ago to assist the US in their war fighting communism along the border with Vietnam and Laos. What does that mean? That means that a whole lot of my people died along a border that nobody knows about. And those people, my people, are buried in these jungles. And our voices were never heard, really. We're still an unknown people. And the reason why I bring this up is that there are players in the Ukraine-Russia conflict today that most of you have never heard of, that most of you may not know of, and may only learn maybe years from now or decades from now. And so some of us have the privilege and the access to actually go to the land and talk to the people and try to understand what they are going through. So yes, the propaganda is true on all sides. You're going to hear whatever government is involved in this conflict, they all have a purpose, they all have a mission, they all have a goal. They have certain people that they want to prop up, so does the US, right? And so as a daughter of a, I guess, former CIA sort of employee, I was forced to come to this country because we could not be safe in Laos because we helped the US. Eventually, we were refugees into the US. I had to learn to speak English. I had to learn a whole another language. I had to become an American. I had to be able to figure out a whole new world. And that's why I needed to go to Ukraine to try to understand the movement of internally displaced people within the country, but also beyond the country. Ukrainians living in New York today, Ukrainians living in France, Ukrainians living in Poland, Turkey, everywhere else. And let me tell you, they don't care about this propaganda. They're not thinking about which government is doing what. They want to know if their home is still standing. They want to know when electricity is going to come back. They want to know when the next food donation will arrive. And they want to know if their children are going to be able to go to school without dying because those schools currently don't have bomb shelters. So Zelensky is on his third visit to the US. He will offer his thoughts, plead, hope that Congress gives him more aid, more military support. That is what people are listening to, right? They're hearing headlines. Zelensky did this, Zelensky's moving here, Zelensky's moving there. What we're hearing are just bomb attacks here and there. I went to Ukraine last summer, spent most of the summer there talking to people about food insecurity, about losing generations, and also to understand the conflict. And what we are saying here today is not only is the conflict difficult to understand, but for them, the conflict did start in 2014. They call this the full-scale war because the war started back in 2014. And so we are understanding this in a very different way. The people there, in fact, even the people living on the West, are finally understanding what the people in the East were already living with for years. And so I just want to be able to sort of point out that, and I just want to pull out this map really quick. This might be a little hard to see, but most people have no idea that Ukraine is about the size of Texas. It's huge. And the war started far east. And even the people on the far west didn't fully understand what was happening in 2014 in terms of the war. And so what I found essentially is that the country, the people, are extremely divided about what is happening in the conflict. They have brothers and sisters living in Moscow. They have grandparents who are living in Russia. They have blood relatives that they are fighting against, that they aren't speaking to. Sister-in-laws, family, all kinds of history that's very, very complex. And the people of Ukraine are as diverse as we are in the US. We just don't know about these things. And so I just want to sort of hint to where I'm coming from and what I've seen and to be able to share more of what I've understood. But I hope that one of the key takeaways that you get from this is that the truths about war isn't going to be easily revealed to all of us for a long time to come. What we continue to talk about as analysts, as reporters and whatnot, we are only a sliver, a thread of the real bigger picture of what's happening there. And so I just want to kind of leave it at that. But the propaganda is real on all sides. And we all have to try and understand that one message is being dominated over another, and we have to ask ourselves why.
Okay. Obviously, we're going to open up the questions in a little bit, but I wanted to go back to you, Aaron. You mentioned Libya, you mentioned Iraq, obviously the invasion of Iraq, and it's amazing. This is just my own aside. The levels of hypocrisy that we've seen. I remember even listening to NPR, which, you know, I know you're not responsible for what's aired on NPR, Doualy, just because you worked there for so long, where there was an interview with Condoleezza Rice, and it was Steve Inskeep interviewing her, and she was openly stating how it's unacceptable. We cannot allow, in a civilized world of nations, of civilized nations, we cannot allow a sovereign, a powerful nation to invade a sovereign nation without any reason. And Steve Inskeep, as a host, as somebody who one would think is somewhat enlightened, didn't raise any kind of sub-question to that. and it amazed me that Condoleezza Rice was the national security advisor as the U.S. was occupying Iraq for no reason, right? And it didn't even occur to Steve Inskeep to say, but wait a minute, didn't that happen? So the reason why I raise it is because as we see what's happening now, not since 2014, but since this horrific military incursion, invasion, attack, onslaught that the Russians pulled starting on February 24th, 2022, we can see, I mean, I can see why Ukrainians would want to resist that to the teeth. I can see why they would look for any help anywhere in the world to resist that to the teeth. I remember when it was happening in Iraq, when suddenly you started seeing these insurgents popping up all over the place, call them whatever. Here in the US, they were referred to as terrorists because they were fighting against American soldiers. But they were resisting an occupation that was started against them, against their country, and they were being supported by foreign interests, etc. So there's a contradiction and a hypocrisy in the US policymaking world around that, but is there a kind of a contradiction and hypocrisy in the statements or the position that the Ukrainian, continuing to support Ukraine in their resistance is not healthy? Does that make sense? I'm not sure.
Totally,
if I
totally. Yeah, you're saying it's like if you're going to support the right of people to resist a foreign occupation, which of course people have, then how can you say we shouldn't be arming Ukraine? And is there hypocrisy there on leftists like myself who have that position? And yeah, by the way, it's just amazing. I mean, there's the Iraq war, there's Libya, there's the U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. We're currently occupying 1/3 of Syria. U.S. military troops are in Syria. And as Donald Trump said, we're there to take the oil. And yet our same officials get up and say we care about territorial integrity and sovereignty. So that we can dismiss. But on this actual tough question of, so Ukraine was invaded, so why can't we support them resist the invader? I mean, in principle, yes, of course. If you're invaded, you have the right to resist. And Ukrainians have every right to resist their invaders. And I totally understand any Ukrainian who takes that position. The question is, though, for people who are not in Ukraine on the outside, what is the best role we can play? And I think that requires an honest look at our role. And, I outlined some of the history, but way before Russia invaded, the U.S. decided to use Ukraine for a proxy war. And when there were reasonable opportunities to end the war that began after the coup in 2014, the U.S. has stood in the way. And so it's a long history to get into, but if you accept that narrative as I do, then it's pretty clear that our obligation is not to try to use Ukraine to bleed Russia. It's to end this war as soon as possible. And at this point, I don't even know anymore if Russia would engage in talks because they've been burned. I mentioned earlier the Minsk Peace Accords, which were reached in 2015 to end the civil war that began in eastern Ukraine in 2014, the year before, after the coup. And since then, the brokers of the Minsk Accords, Angela Merkel and François Hollande of Germany and France, have said, oh yeah, by the way, the Minsk Accords were just kind of a ruse. They were never intended to bring peace. They were intended to help Ukraine. Thank you. They were intended to buy Ukraine some time to rearm, to prepare for war. Now, I don't think they're being serious. I think they're just saying that now because the West, Europe, has gotten so jingoistic and pro-war. But when Russia hears stuff like that, and when they see what happened in April 2022, when there was reportedly a peace deal reached, Russia might conclude we can't negotiate with these people anymore. Jan Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, recently said that, let me get the exact quote. He said something that when other people say it, they get accused of being pro-Putin. Like when I've said similar things, I've been called a Russian apologist. Jens Stoltenberg said, so he was talking about in the weeks before the war, Russia put out these draft treaties to NATO and the US. And it was a whole bunch of things. And they wanted, first of all, for Ukraine to pledge not to join NATO because Russia does not want a hostile military alliance on its borders, especially when you have millions of people inside of Ukraine who identify with Russia. And the problem with that it was outlined by William Burns, who's now Biden's CIA chief. But back in 2008, he was Bush's ambassador to Russia. And he warned in a cable. It was called Niet means Niet, which means no means no. It's put up by WikiLeaks. He warned in a cable that Russia was warning that NATO expansion to Ukraine is the brightest of all red lines for Russia, because if a civil war breaks out inside of Ukraine, then Russia will be forced to take a side. If a civil war breaks out over the issue of NATO inside of Ukraine, then Russia will be forced to take a side and intervene. And Burns was warning this back in 2008, and what he foretold was exactly correct. That's what happened, because millions of people inside Ukraine speak Russian, they have family in Russia, and they identify with Russia. And so when you have a divided country where some people hate Russia, some people love Russia, the answer is to keep it, I think, is to keep it neutral, not try to force it into one camp, whether it's the pro-Russian camp or the pro-US camp. So Russia put out this proposal in December 2021 to address this. Neutrality for Ukraine, also a commitment to roll back offensive weaponry surrounding Russia in neighboring states. Just as the US would not accept offensive missiles aimed at Washington or New York, in Canada or Mexico, Russia wanted the same commitment. And they also wanted a rollback of NATO military infrastructure after NATO was expanded in the late 90s. And Stoltenberg said, of course we didn't sign that. And as a result, he added, Putin, quote, went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his borders, unquote. So that's Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, saying that Putin, quote, went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his borders. So he's acknowledging what, when other people say it, is dismissed as Russian propaganda. So the question is, do we want to have a proxy war? Hundreds of thousands of people die for the sake of the theoretical right to bring NATO to Russia's borders, which, by the way, the US doesn't even want to give to Ukraine anyway. And that was underscored recently when there was a NATO summit, and Ukraine was expecting a pledge from the US and its allies on how it can join NATO. And the US wouldn't even give them that, because ultimately it doesn't actually want to have to defend Ukraine against Russia, because that means a world war. It wants to use the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO to formally integrate it into NATO's military infrastructure without actually binding it to defend Ukraine. So do we need to go on with this long game of using Ukraine against Russia, or can we just respect the differences that exist inside the country and pledge to keep it neutral? I think keeping Ukraine neutral, respecting its differences, is a much better preference than to fuel this war, in which Ukraine, by the way, it's certainly not doing as well as we're told in the media. And I wasn't there. I mean, you can give us a better indication of how things are going, but from what I know, we've been given a misleading picture of how the war is going. What I hear from Ukraine, there's a lot of people dying, a lot of people losing their limbs, and for what? For the sake of bleeding Russia? I just don't think that's a worthy goal.
So maybe, Doualy, you can touch on that issue, focusing on the different perspectives of people on the ground that you were engaging with, not only in the first visit, but more recently. I think it's probably more telling after now months, if not over a year, of this war, this ongoing war. The desire for resistance, the desire to get back at Russia. What are your thoughts on that?
So at this point in time, I've probably interviewed about 350 Ukrainians, a little more than that, all across the country, traveling from Lviv to Kyiv to Kharkiv, essentially from the far west to the far east, Zaporizhia, Odessa, Dnipro, north and south. And there isn't one voice that can say that represents the overall feeling there. In fact, the sense that many of them have is this war is about the past and the future. That's how plainly people speak. They are saying that Putin wants to revert to an old thinking, an old history. Putin wants everyone to continue to speak Russian. And so the interesting thing that I witnessed is that if there was a hint of nationalism or radicalism before among Ukrainians, that revolution is now. Ukrainians are revolting against speaking Russian, against appreciating Russian history, Russian art, the Russian language. There are people, Ukrainians to Ukrainians, who are disgusted when they hear the Russian language. But in fact, that's what most people were taught growing up in Ukraine. And so there is a very mixed view of the war, of why the war started, why the war continues. And people, in fact, are unhappy about Zelensky. There's, on one end, it's Zelensky isn't a true president. We are not getting what we need to win this war. He doesn't understand. He's just an actor, someone who was propped up and put in place. He's not really governing and ruling the country. And there are others who say, Zelensky, he never left us. We are more proud than ever to have him as our president. The country is divided on so many levels. It's the fracturing of what's happening internally is actually, to me, the story that isn't being told. That's the story for me that is important. How divided the people are, how radicalized people have become, and the desperation that people have right now. They are living under martial law. What does that mean? It's not just about a curfew. It's about lack of police. It's about taking things into your own hands and dealing with the law on your own terms. It's about the disappearance of people. Corruption already existed in Ukraine before the war, and it continues now in even greater ways. I want to play a clip. Maté, do you mind just grabbing? I think it's already up. Yeah. I just want you all to take in this voice.
Where is it?
The message.
Just hit it. Okay, here it is. I see it. It's on pause, but it's not moving.
The voice that you are about to
Lana,
hear.
your job is extremely hard. I imagine even before the war it was hard, but now it's even harder. And I want to help people understand what your tasks are, what your daily sort of ritual, routine, what do you do, what time do you get up, what is your day like, and how do you get through your days?
Не знаю, чи за час війни, то якийсь один день схожий на інший. Просто так живеш. Встаєш вранці, йдеш на роботу. Сам, робиш свою роботу, йдеш на обхід, оглядаєш хворих. У нас 80%
Crazy things. So one day by day during the wartime, there is the same those days. It's like a routine nowadays for me. So I just come to all of my ill clients first, early in the morning. I try to collect their stories. How do they feel? What conflict they have with their wives, with their families. Then I go to write down all the stories, to give them some medicines, and then I'm going one more time all this road to understand what's going on. Maybe something changed during their individual therapy sessions or something else. And in the end, I don't like to talk about those days because they are so hard, so difficult, and and everything ends in the evening when I just sit and pray for those guys. And during weekends, when I think that a lot of people think that it's a great time to have some rest, but I'm just crying and praying for those guys, for them not to make a suicide. And however, sometimes I really receive those phone calls when my colleague said that it's over for somebody, and they're doing it in so different ways, and it's something so hard.
So that is Lana. She's a clinical psychologist, therapist living in Kyiv. On the day of the war, it was her husband and children that were tasked to leave. They wanted her to leave with them. She said she had a job to do. She wasn't going to leave Ukraine. So it was her husband who was able to take her children out of Ukraine to safety. She stayed on. Her hospital was turned into a military hospital, and she witnessed the casualties of the earliest casualties of the war. And she continues to see soldiers coming from the front lines. And what she's trying to do is to save the people who actually survived the front lines, because she doesn't want more deaths. And so many of them want to die. They want to die what she says is a hero's death, because so many of them died. She's trying to keep those who come back, who have PTSD, alive. And what I'm trying to say is that the stories that we're hearing continue to be about Zelensky's visit, about the money, about the hardware, about, whether there's going to be a grain corridor that's going to open up. But in fact, for the people, the pain of what they are going through, the daily decisions that they have to make, from do I go buy, groceries at this hour? Do I take a shower at this moment? When is it best to navigate the potential missiles that are coming down? As all of you know, with today's headlines, a lot of missiles rained down on Ukraine in the last couple of days because of Zelensky's visit to the US. And so what I was doing was capturing the voices of women, young people, and essentially the workers, the people who are searching for jobs, the people who are navigating winters without power, the people who are desperately trying to reunite with their children in other parts of the world, the people who, even before the war, were already going through a divorce with their family. Remember, even before this war, people had lives, people had hopes and dreams. And what they're doing right now is they're trying to hold on to the last of that in order to just get through. And for me, and I think for many who are documenting this, the real story is what happens after the war is over. Because many of them thought the war was going to end within weeks. And now they realize that this is a very long war ahead of them. And it's going to be another cold winter and another hard future.
We're going to get to questions hopefully very soon. I want you to follow up on that, and Aaron to answer the same question I'm about to ask Doualy. And from and I'm monitoring and reading a lot about the war constantly in different outlets. But the general frame is that given the horrors of what the Ukrainians have had to deal with, the receiving end of this aggression by Russia, that there's no space, there's no tolerance for discussion of ceding territory or for negotiations, that no, we have to beat them back, right? So to what extent did you see that in the Ukrainian population that you've met with, and how, and Aaron, your thoughts about how that could hinder any attempt at a diplomatic negotiated settlement to this terrible conflict?
Well, my answer is going to be pretty short on this because from the perspective of many of the people that I spoke to, they want Russia to no longer exist. There is no peace negotiation. There is no, even if Russia returned the borders to what it was, that is not something that they want Russia to no longer exist.
And the problem is that Russia has nuclear weapons. And so if we're asking to advocate a policy in which Russia no longer exists, we're basically asking that none of this exists, because that's where that would head. And so I don't want to diminish the feelings of anybody who believes that, because I understand. How could you not believe that if your family, your community, your country is being attacked? I get it. But from the outside, it's our responsibility to do everything we can to minimize human suffering. And the question is, does that entail keeping the war going or trying to find some way to end it? And let me just say, the suffering was anticipated by the U.S. and it was brought on. So let me read you something from the New York Times. This is from a year ago in the New York Times. It says this, quote, "Some American officials expressed concern that the most dangerous moments are yet to come, even as Putin has avoided escalating the war in ways that have at times baffled Western officials. Putin has made only limited attempts to destroy critical infrastructure or to target Ukrainian government buildings." So this was a year ago. At that point, according to Western officials, Russia had only made, quote, "limited attempts to destroy critical infrastructure or to target Ukrainian government buildings." Now, after that, that changed. This was the fall of 2022. In the weeks after that, Russia did escalate its war and did start much worse acts of collective punishment against Ukrainian civilians, including attacking the power grid during winter. And I have no doubt that they'll do that again this winter. But note the language there, that Putin has avoided escalating the war in ways that have baffled Western officials. Now, what they were referring to, I think, is that when the U.S. goes into a war, immediately the U.S. takes out basic infrastructure. If you look at the Iraq War, one of the first targets were government buildings in Baghdad and sewage treatment plants, power plants, all the basics that keep things running. Russia didn't do that because Russia's goal, I think, in the immediate weeks of the war was not to erase Ukraine, as we're told. It was to compel the negotiations that had previously been avoided. And that's why you had that peace deal I talked about earlier being reached. So when you have U.S. officials acknowledging that Russia had previously avoided targeting infrastructure and fearing that the most dangerous moments were yet to come, why would you not do everything you can to avoid those dangerous moments? And they didn't. They instead allowed it to happen because they stood in the way of diplomacy at every single turn. And that's the policy. And I just don't see how ultimately that's in the interest of Ukrainians. In terms of what would be a reasonable policy, why not propose having referendums in the territories that are disputed? In Crimea, there's no one doubts anymore. The majority of Crimeans want to join Russia. Whether, Russia held these referendums, which were dismissed as a sham, and fair enough, they were held under military circumstances. But if you look at U.S. government-funded polls of Crimea, the vast majority of people, U.S. government-funded polls, the vast majority want to be a part of Russia. In the areas of the Donbass that are now contested, I suspect it's a lot more split. I don't think you have overwhelming support for Russia there. And certainly, as Professor X was saying, people have been hardened against Russia by the fact there was an invasion. But why not at least propose to have a referendum and see what people think? That to me is one solution that could help overcome this impasse. And again, is the alternative of endless proxy war, sending in this drip feed of weapons to keep the war going. That to me is not a solution either. So we have to try something.
So I think, Marty, we have about 20 minutes, 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So if anybody have any questions or concerns that you want to raise with either of the panelists, so as we wait for people to take it over, please. I guess this is the microphone they'll use. So what role do U.S. taxpayers play in this? More than half the country probably disconnected entirely from the situation, and then we see the ongoing typical battles going on, the politics as usual in Washington. Should we or should we not fund the Ukrainians? So what role does the U.S. play, or is it so marginal as a concern for the public? And both of you, I mean, your thoughts as seasoned and veteran journalists who've been covering these issues, these types of issues for so long. What role does this group here have to play?
I was going to say, I think we should ask the young people here, what do they think? Do they think that funding this, helping to fund this conflict, what is the value of that? I think it's something they should think about, because even among my own students, I don't think that many of them realize that their money is going to this war.
$112 billion so far.
Did all of you know this? That your money, your taxes are going to Ukraine?
Any thoughts? Chris, you have the microphone. Did you want to raise a question?
Hi. Yeah. I guess this goes out more to Aaron. You mentioned how how there was a coup in Ukraine in 2014, but it was my understanding that it wasn't really a peaceful revolution, but it was mostly a revolution gained by the people, not quite the military of Ukraine. I just hope you could expand on that.
You're right. It wasn't by the military. And the problem is, from my perspective, and this is a very contested issue, so, there are people who would vehemently disagree with what I'm saying. But the thing is, there was what you can call a popular uprising in 2013, 2014. But that popular uprising is not what led to the change of government. What happened to me was you had a popular uprising against a very corrupt president named Yanukovych, who was going to sign this agreement with the European Union to bring Ukraine closer into the EU. And then he didn't, and then he backtracked. And the conventional narrative we get is that Yanukovych sold out the Ukrainian people who wanted to join the West because he's pro-Russian. And then you had this peaceful revolution rise up against him, and that forced him out of power. But there's some problems with that. First of all, there were protests against Yanukovych in late 2013 that were totally peaceful. They were against corruption, and the people wanted to be closer to the West. The problem, though, is that those protests were then hijacked by who I would call far-right nationalists and even neo-Nazis, who worship a guy named Stefan Bandera, who was a neo-Nazi collaborator during the Second World War, and wanted to basically wipe out Russian culture inside of Ukraine. And it was that far-right contingent who was the muscle that led to the coup in 2014. And just to illustrate, let me quote to you one thing. This is from Foreign Policy magazine, the heart of the establishment. But in March 2014, a month after the coup, this is what Foreign Policy magazine wrote. This is an article by two specialists with Western think tanks. They say this: the uncomfortable truth is that a sizable portion of Kiev's current government and the protesters who brought it to power are indeed fascists. And that was a reflection of the fact that these people were part of parties like Svoboda and Right Sector and Azov, who all worshipped Bandera and all thought of Russians as subhuman and said openly anti-Semitic things, to the point where even one of those parties had been listed by the European Union as being anti-Semitic and bigots. So the point is, I'm sorry for the long answer, the initial protests, totally peaceful, people were very upset with Yanukovych for not signing this EU agreement, but it was hijacked by a far-right contingent, and that's who ultimately the U.S. supported in bringing Yanukovych to power. And there was a lot of violence, and certainly there were government crackdowns on the protests that were very, very brutal, and that galvanized the protests. But it was a coup. It was an overthrow of a government. Now, whatever you think of Yanukovych, he was corrupt, but he was democratically elected and he was overthrown. And you can see how problematic this was when right afterwards you had an uprising begin in the East from people who didn't want to see the president they voted for being ousted in a coup. And that set off the mess we're in today.
And of course, that became known as the Maidan Revolution. So for those of you who know that term, that phrase, questions, anyone?
let me say one more thing. I'm sorry. Even on the issue behind the Maidan, the whole thing of whether or not to join the EU. The problem was Yanukovych wanted to join the EU, but once he read the fine print, the EU was demanding that Ukraine submit to all these harsh austerity demands, which is very standard for for countries that want to join into IMF programs and EU programs. They wanted Yanukovych to basically fire public sector workers and to slash gas subsidies. Yanukovych read this and he realized this would be not only bad for Ukrainians, who maybe he didn't even care about, but certainly for his own political future, he realized this would be a death sentence, that if I sign on to cutting gas subsidies and cutting wages, I'm done for. So he tried to get a new deal, but before he could get a new deal, he was overthrown. And if you look at polls from that time, they clearly show the country was actually very, very, very split. There was a poll in the Washington Post reported on by two Western political scientists, and who said this in the Washington Post right around the time of the Maidan coup. They said, quote, "There is very little evidence that a clear majority of Ukrainians support integration into the EU. Around 40 to 45% support support the European integration, as compared to 30 to 40% support for the Russian-led customs union." So the point is there again, as we've been saying before, Ukraine was very, very divided. And when you have a divided country, you can either choose to respect those divisions or force it into one camp. The U.S. policy was to force it into one camp. And I think that helps explain why we're in the mess we're in today.
We have a question back there, another question.
Hi, thank you both for such insightful perspectives. I just have two quick questions. The first one is regarding your perspective on directly interviewing the people in Ukraine. And I just wanted to ask why you specifically chose to visit a physiotherapist and how that perspective has been so helpful. And the second question is what you may suppose people in Vietnam or Laos might view of this war today, given the context of the Vietnam War.
Very good questions. I spoke to women of all different career choices and backgrounds. I simply pulled this particular person because it was sort of at the top of my list. But I've been interviewing women, for example, there are more female drivers in Ukraine now than ever before because there aren't enough men to do that work today. So it's women who are crossing borders. It's women who are doing some very, very heavy lifting. And it's women who are going to the front lines and bringing the bodies back to families. And so that's some of the work that I was doing, just trying to understand the role of women today versus what it was like before this. Because I must admit that when I go to Ukraine, even today, the Ukrainian women are beautiful and bold, and they are dressed. And I have not met one single Ukrainian woman who does not have her nails done. And not just in like the simplest way. I'm talking about the hard enamel, gorgeous colorings, like that takes hours to sit through. And I'm always going, the person doing nails, for example, she's booked out months in advance. What does that say about Ukrainian women, right? It means that they're also, I'll say one more thing about this Ukrainian woman. There was a school that I went to, and a cook at this school had to live under Russian occupation, under soldiers for 45 days. They were held up in the basement of this school, and she had to cook with Russian soldiers, armed with rifles. She had to feed kids for, a month and plus. And she said that not one day passed when she didn't do her eyebrows, and to make sure that even the Russian soldiers were going to see like the fierceness, the boldness of Ukrainian women. So I just want to sort of say that on the side about that. I think that the people, the indigenous people, the unknown ethnic communities that were part of the Vietnam War, they would see this war and just they would call out what Maté would say is the hypocrisies of what's currently happening now. Because for them, they know that the war started in Vietnam long before it was ever even heard, long before anyone even knew that there was war in Vietnam. There were already operators doing what they needed to do, gathering intelligence, collecting data, and maneuvering the people in place, dropping food, dropping all kinds of supplies in places that they weren't supposed to be in. And so they would see this war and say, you know, we don't really know what's happening in Ukraine right now. The things that are being surfaced, it's being surfaced for a reason. And only until this war is over will we start to unpack the realities of what is happening there. So that's the complexity of war, and that we just don't hear a lot about those who are on the ground, those who are hidden in certain places, and also those who are spying for Russia on both sides.
I just have a question about like specifically how obviously we got to hear from the therapist, which was incredible, but how else are the people you've spoken to, specifically the young people and the women, how are they being affected by the human rights violations, and how are people coping with such extreme issues?
Well, I'll tell you that some of them are singing about it. Some of them are performing about it. They're creating plays. They are creating music. They're creating songs. They want the world to know their suffering and their journeys. And they're also getting married. They're also determined to fulfill their dreams within the war zones. And so if you look on social media, there are some tremendous works being done, great art displays and great sort of collaborations in different parts of the world with people who are currently in the war zone and people who are outside of the war zone. So the young people there are basically saying, we are not going to let this war ruin us and destroy us. We're going to fight and try and figure things out. When I went back this time around, I was there for 3 weeks, ending in August. I met a young woman who said, you know, Doualy, I finally started seeing a therapist and I'm learning Spanish. I want to figure out where I'm going after this. I want to heal. I want to get through this somehow. And I'll say one more thing here, which is that I was holding literally a mic to a soldier in the city of Zaporizhia, and he was finishing up a conversation, and I was kind of doing this, and a Russian missile went down within maybe 4 kilometers from us, which is very, very close. We heard the missile hit. I looked at the company and the interviewee, and I was like, shouldn't we go down to the bomb shelter? And they were very serious to me, and they laughed at me, and they said, Doualy, if you can hear the missiles, then you're fine. If you can't hear it, then we're dead. It doesn't matter. And they literally were like, oh, you're such a visitor. Like, you know, what are you afraid of? It's okay. And I'm thinking, because there's another missile that's probably going to come down. There's something else. And they're like, this is what we do. We live with this. And so that's how frightening, despite all of the madness, they're still trying to learn Spanish. I met a young woman who was learning Korean. She loves K-pop, and she just was like, oh, I'm looking forward to one day when I can go visit South Korea and visit my K-pop idol. I'm like, How?
Marty, right here up front.
Oh,
It's been a cardinal point of U.S. foreign policy since the beginning of the Cold War to oppose Russia and to weaken Russia. So I'll grant you that. But at the same time, it's also been a cardinal point of U.S. foreign policy to defend and safeguard human rights around the world. And could it not be that a goal of the war is to somehow oppose and cancel out these incredible crimes against humanity, the Russian military against the Ukrainian people? And then just one more point that you might want to comment on. We have a relation who's the Ukrainian consul in New York that we see periodically, and we're having dinner with him tomorrow night. What should I ask him?
Well, look, I don't accept the premise of the question that it's been a goal of U.S. policy to promote human rights. And I would point to killing millions of people in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. I would point to supporting the death squads in Central America in the 1980s. I'd point to supporting Saudi Arabia's genocidal war in Yemen, the support for the Israeli occupation of Palestine going on for decades now. I can go on and on and on. But let's say all of a sudden the U.S. woke up and had an epiphany that it wants to now protect human rights. Is the best way to do that to funnel tens of billions of dollars into a war over who gets to rule Eastern Ukraine and block reasonable peace negotiations? Now, some people might say there's no talking with Russia. They're the aggressor. They're like Hitler. You can't talk to them. Okay, if that's your position, fine. But there are plenty of U.S. officials who've warned since the 1990s that expanding NATO was a dangerous thing. George Kennan, the father of American diplomacy, he warned about that. Charles Kupchan, who served on Obama's National Security Council, he said that it's reasonable for Russia to not want to have NATO on its borders. So there's at least inside the establishment some people willing to say that this is worth negotiating. So then should we then take the position that we're not even going to talk about it, which has been the Biden administration's position so far, or can we at least try to talk about it? And maybe, I don't think so, but maybe the people who think that Putin's like Hitler will be proven right, and that no negotiations will solve the problem. And if that's the case, fine. I would admit that I'm wrong. But if you're not going to even try diplomacy, and if you're going to block the few times it's produced some concrete results, like for example that early 2022 peace deal that went somewhere according to the people involved, I don't see how that's an optimal outcome. I think what you're doing is prolonging the war and sentencing more and more Ukrainians to die, and I don't want to do that. I think diplomacy should at least be tried. In terms of the question to your friend, I would say, what do you know about this peace deal that was reported in early 2022? Is it true that there was a peace deal reached? Because we haven't gotten we haven't seen the document itself. Putin held it up once at a meeting with African leaders and said that Ukraine signed this, and he showed an initial, but they haven't released it. So I would ask your friend, what do you know about that, and do you think that could be a possible solution if it's still on the table, rather than keeping this war going?
Yeah, I think what could be asked is the role of the international community, right? Because not everybody is hook, line, and sinker with the idea of arming Ukraine to the teeth and trying to defeat Russia. In fact, if you look at Latin America, you look at Africa, you look at India. India is a world power, but they're not taken seriously. And so the idea the question, it's really a question: what role, and do you see a role, both of you, of the international community to demand diplomacy, demand some kind of negotiation to put an end? Because every country in the world is affected by this in one way or another. Whether they're directly involved or not. So what are the possibilities you see as we get closer to the end of the time of that approach, which I have my doubts, but.
Just to ask your friend, I should actually say, how many planes of young people can we sponsor to bring to the U.S. to get some of these students to have some a chance for a real education, a better education. And to your question, Mario, that's a complicated one. Would you like to go first? I think you might have more.
Well, I can just say people like Brazil's Lula, he's advocated peace negotiations from the start. And the Biden administration basically told him to shut up because they don't want to have that kind of talk. By the way, I should say, Mark Milley, who is the top U.S. military officer in this country, he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's leaving this month. But a year ago, or almost 10 months ago, he advocated negotiations. He said that Ukraine has gone as far as it can go on the battlefield, and we need to have negotiations. This is the top military officer in the U.S. I've never seen anything like this before. It was unprecedented. To have a military leader come out and say we should have diplomacy. He is more pro-diplomacy than our diplomats, than Tony Blinken, who is our Secretary of State, which is unbelievable. And he was told to shut up, and he pretty much did, although he's repeated his stance a couple of times since. So, being for diplomacy is not just some radical lefty or, at this point, far-right idea. It's from the heart of the establishment. And amazingly, things are so jingoistic and pro-war in this country that when the congressional progressives, about a year ago, released a letter politely asking Biden, like, hey, since we're funding this war, could you maybe do something to try to negotiate an end to it? They got such a backlash that within 24 hours, they withdrew their letter. They withdrew, which is also unprecedented. And a few weeks later, that's when Mark Milley came out and said, actually, you know what, they were right. We should have negotiations. But things have gotten so pro-war that rather than saying, yeah, we were right, we do stand behind our letter calling for diplomacy, the progressives stayed silent and have continued to support the proxy war since. But on the international stage, it's very different. And Lula of Brazil, South Africa, the global South is certainly not united behind this war. And there are many people who've been calling for negotiations and would love to play a role. But the problem is the U.S. is the hegemon. The U.S. power and influence is just so massive that it will take a change in U.S. policy, I think, to really make a difference.
So as someone who was based in South Korea when Kim Jong-il died, and I covered his death and the reaction in South Korea to the North's leader, and then witnessing the current North Korean leader visiting Russia, I think it's one of those very complicated moments where you have to ask yourself, what does Russia and North Korea have in common? How do you negotiate with people like Kim Jong-un and today's Putin? And what at this point can be at the table? And that's something someone like me wouldn't begin to really start to analyze, because as far as the ordinary people, those negotiations are far, far from them. And those are the people that I've been focused on. So,
If I could make one more quick point.
I think
Do I have time?
I'm going to take preference to a student.
Okay.
Maybe a couple, that one question and then.
Okay. Just a quick point. It's okay.
Yeah.
Just unfortunately for Ukraine, this is not just about Ukraine anymore. Ukraine was caught up in a much bigger game, which is that I talked earlier about the U.S. expanding NATO. That's one thing, but also, and this is I haven't addressed this yet. In the last 20 years, thanks to the Bush administration, Dick Cheney and George W. Bush and John Bolton and all their wisdom, the U.S. has been repeatedly abandoning arms control treaties between the U.S. and Russia that kept the peace. So the first thing they did was tear up something called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. That was John Bolton's work. And that was a 1972 treaty that really de-escalated tensions between the two countries and really reduced the chances of nuclear war. John Bolton, in his wisdom, tore that up because he hates arms control. That was followed under the Trump administration when John Bolton came back, and Bolton tore up the INF Treaty, which was reached under Reagan and Gorbachev, had eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, thousands of them. John Bolton, the genius, tore that up too. And even though he was working for Trump and Trump was doing something that radically escalated tensions with Russia, Democrats here and the US media were too busy fantasizing that Trump was really a Russian agent doing Vladimir Putin's bidding. So they didn't pay any attention to Trump tearing up this vital arms control treaty. And Russia has seen that happen and has been trying to restore those treaties. But so far in this climate, there's no appetite for that. And that's another thing that will have to be addressed. So unfortunately, Ukraine has gotten caught up in that, because what tearing up these treaties does is it gives both countries the capacity to hit each other. And so the US now has missile sites in Poland and Romania, thanks to what John Bolton did, that can, they can't hit Russia right now, but they easily could be used, converted to hit Russia. And Russia wants that addressed as well. And so something like that, if we're going to have a sustaining peace, will have to be addressed eventually. And the question is, in my opinion, does any administration have the political courage to stand up and say this march to death for everybody has to end?
Time for one last point. You have the last word.
No, I didn't.
He's going to ask now.
All right, thank you. I have a question for Aaron. Why do you think that a peace deal where Ukraine permanently gives up land, why do you think it guarantees long-term peace? And what guarantees that Russia doesn't use that land as a springboard to invade again in 5, 10, 20 years?
That's a fair question, but so it would have to be bound with guarantees in which Russia commits to not invading Ukraine, to respecting its sovereignty. But also, you have to ask, why would Russia want to invade Ukraine? Back in 2014, these breakaway republics of the Donbass that revolted against the new government after the coup, they voted immediately to join Russia. Russia, if it wanted to take over parts of Ukraine, could have said back then, look, we have these votes, great, we're taking them. Russia didn't want that. Russia actually encouraged these breakaway republics to negotiate with Kiev to keep Ukraine's borders intact. So I don't see, according to the record, I don't think Russia, up until this point, wanted to absorb those parts of Ukraine. And I don't think Russia, certainly based on the hard time it's had in this war so far, where everybody expected it would march to Kiev and take it over within days, I don't think Russia wants to have this fight again. But you're right. Anything's possible. Maybe some future Russian government will go back on its word and invade again. So, I think it's worth taking that chance rather than keeping this horrific war going now.
Well, thank you for your questions and your participation. Thank you, Aaron and Doualy. And well, let's keep paying attention. Thank you so much. Thank you, Marty.
And just so everybody knows, the flag and the items I have up here isn't because I'm Slava Ukraina. It's because the people who made the flag and made this art were the people that I interviewed. And so that's that. Thank you.